Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to the Royal College of Physicians. My name is Natalie Craven. I'm Public Programme Officer in the Library, Archive and Museum team. And we're very pleased to welcome you all tonight to RCP members and fellows, our exhibition regulars, and those of you visiting us for the first time. I'd like to thank the speakers that we're about to hear from tonight for being so generous with their time, my colleagues in the museum department, and our museum volunteers for supporting tonight's event. We're not expecting a fire alarm, but if we do, there is a fire alarm exit, at the back of the hall and at the side as well, downstairs, and we'll gather on the cobbles in St Andrew's Place. If you haven't already found them, the toilets and facilities are on the lower ground floor. If you'd like to follow our conversation on social media, please use the hashtag RCPUnderTheSkin, and please do follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. We are at RCP Museum. Thank you to Sam, who's upstairs, providing tonight's live stage text subtitles, which will appear magically on the screen. So they're not automated. There's a lady upstairs tapping away furiously. And after tonight's event is also being live streamed on YouTube, and it will be available as a recording afterwards. After tonight's discussions, please do visit the exhibition Under the Skin if you haven't done already, and we're also open late on the first Thursday of the month if you don't have a chance this evening. I'd now like to hand over to my colleague Katie Birkwood, who will introduce tonight's topic and our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. And a big, very special thank you to all of our speakers tonight, Sofie Layton, Nicola Strickland, Liz Orton, Ian Berle and Amanda Couch, for being so generous with your time and your ideas in what I hope is going to be a really stimulating and interesting evening's discussion. While I'm here, I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Natalie Craven, our Public Programmes Officer, because she's the person who did all the organising to make this event happen, and things like this wouldn't happen without her here. So I'm Katie Birkwood. I'm the Rare Books librarian here at the Royal College of Physicians. That means that one of the things I get to do is look after all these fabulous old books you see on the walls around you here. And I was also lead curator of our current exhibition, Under the Skin, Anatomy, Art and Identity. The exhibition started as a technical exploration of how anatomical illustrations represent the three-dimensionality of the human body as part of a collaboration, an interdisciplinary collaboration called Thinking 3D. But the more time I spent with these books, the more it became apparent to me that as I was leafing through image after image of bodies in various states of dismemberment, it was impossible to only think about the technologies and the techniques in these images, and my mind kept being drawn to the people in the pictures. Who were they? What would they think about being shown in these books hundreds of years after their death on the walls of a museum or in somebody's personal library? Did they know that their bodies could or would be used in that way? And would they have consented if they did know about it? Anatomical images are masterpieces of science, but they're also very emotionally affecting. Today, when there are so many new and developing technologies for looking inside living bodies, new layers of complexity are added, not least our own personal responses to seeing our own flesh represented on screen or on the page, or maybe in a model in our hands. So the speakers we have here tonight are going to address some of the emotional and ethical and other issues inherent in medical imaging. And after they've each given a short presentation or talk introducing their ideas, there's going to be lots of opportunity for discussion, firstly amongst the panellists, and then we'll be opening the floor to questions from the audience. So I hope you'll all be keen to participate in that and further the discussion. After that, as Natalie says, there'll be time to explore the exhibition further and maybe to have another drink downstairs if you want. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker tonight, and that is Sofie Layton. Sophie's work explores the creative interface between patients and the scientific clinical landscape. Her past work includes site-specific performance, theatre and installations. She conceived and led a project called The Heart of the Matter from 2016 to 2018, which was a national project in the UK funded by Wellcome Trust and Arts Council England, exploring the medical, experiential and metaphorical dimensions of the heart. Her captivating work, The Bud, is one of the pieces we chose for inclusion in the exhibition Under the Skin, and it's the item, the piece at the end of the exhibition gallery that glows and draws everyone in. And if you haven't spent some time really looking at it, I hope you will do later. But before that, let's hear from Sophie. Thank you.
Okay. Right, I'm just orientating myself. Thank you very much, Katie, and it's a pleasure to be here. So my work is about how an artist places themselves in the medical landscape and what the artist can bring to that conversation. I was particularly interested in... No.
Keep talking.
Okay, I feel maybe...
AV magic people will
Okay.
sort it out as you go.
I'm particularly interested in how an artist can support the conversations within the medical landscape. And in 2013, was artist in residence at St Thomas's Hospital and created a piece called Bedside Manners, which explored the relationship of the parent to the child in the clinical sort of space. And this was realised as a sort of an installation which represented that sort of fragile landscape of care. What I realised through being in residence in that situation was that unless I also engaged with the scientific landscape and began to understand the medicine behind the journey of these patients, I was only engaged in half of the conversation, and I wouldn't be able to hold that narrative in a more complex and nuanced way. So in 2015, I was lucky enough to be awarded a Wellcome Trust funding to create a piece called Under the Microscope, which was at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, and I began working on the cardiac unit with mothers with children with young that had congenital heart problems. And I also at the same time began to work with bioengineer Dr. Giovanni Bellino alongside health psychologist Dr. Joe Ray on how, as an artist, I could translate these sort of 3D medical images with their, and how patients jumping in and out of different microphones. And one mother on one of the wards said to me, would it be possible to print a model of my child's hand, my child's heart? And so we managed to do this, and I gave her this model, which you can see in the picture. And it was extraordinary because in that moment, the mother took the bottle, placed it in her hands, and just said, I feel like I'm holding snow in my hands. And for me, that medical piece of data and that anatomical model became a poetic metaphor. And what it allowed the mother to do was to find an expression for the fragility of the landscape that she was in and how she was caring for her daughter. And out of that, we began a much more sort of embedded series of workshops working with young people with congenital heart disease, and I explored different narratives and began to explore how we translate these medical images alongside the sort of more poetic landscapes and narratives. We ran workshops, I played with scale, so I would do a 3D printed heart but reduce it in scale, and so what does it feel like if you hold a small bronze heart in your hand? I also worked at the bedside with young people that were waiting for heart transplants, and created a sort of series of embossed panels that began to explore the narratives that came out of this journey. And what's extraordinary is when you talk about somebody's condition medically. So, for instance, I asked one of the patients, if you were a vegetable, what vegetable would you be? And he said, well, I'd be spinach because I love spinach, but actually I can't eat it very often because of my medication. And the symptom care nurse said, it's extraordinary, I didn't realise that he knew as much about his condition, but through an artist-led narrative process, I can see that he really understands his body and understands the care that is being, that we're taking, the journey that he's on. So as part of this, I sort of created a series of installations that use this medical data, and these are a series of hearts that were part of a research project with young people, and that were able to sit. And so I sat in clinic with a consultant with a child or a young person's medical heart, and through that was able to translate their condition and explore with them what it felt like to hold their heart. And this became a piece called Making the Invisible Visible and Tangible. And what I'm interested in is actually how that journey and that conversation can be shown and shared in different sort of venues. So it was then retranslated for a space, a church in Bristol as part of a festival. And what was interesting is that these medical images become sort of a sacred piece that resonates with that sort of clinical, that sort of church space in that way. And as part of the sort of journey as part of creating this, I also explored what the landscape of heart disease is. So looked at the anatomy, conditions, so the terminology behind like cardiomyopathy, hypoplastic left heart syndrome, all of these very complex medical terms that almost alienate the patient, but they're part of that journey. And alongside that, I put the narratives that I collected with the parents and the young people that were part of that exploration. And then this, as Katie mentioned, was to then sort of realised as a national touring exhibition, which was the Heart of the Matter. And we were lucky enough to tour it to Newcastle, Bristol and London, because we worked with the heart centres in each of those places. One of the pieces that sort of emerged from that process was actually, again, working with a patient and creating her own blueprint. So I gave her an outline of her heart model, and then she drew into it, and it became her own landscape. And she explored how she envisaged her heart, and she filled it with kelp forests and sunflowers and just all of the things that filled her metaphorical heart. And this is the sort of the realization of that set of blueprints. What was very interesting was that I also worked with patients who don't have a medical condition, and how they viewed their heart was quite different. They saw, and a lot of people saw their hearts as a bud or as a seed or as something that gave life. And so I was looking for a form or something that would help realise that. And looking through medical imagery, I began to sort of see that by printing a sort of the cardiovascular system and then literally sort of having it growing out of a soil, it became something else, and it felt very appropriate. The piece here does not act as a biosphere, but what I've done in some places actually is the moisture of the soil allows the whole thing to become sort of a steamy tropical landscape. But given that it's in exhibition for such a long time, I thought it might get a bit smelly. Just sort of summarising, so one of the other narratives that came out of the workshop process was that one young man, I asked him, I said, as an artist, if I was to make your heart for you, what would your heart look like? And he said, well, my heart's really complicated. It's a sort of patchwork, it's a puzzle. It's actually like this Rubik's Cube that can't quite be put back together again. And so I took his heart model and then with him created this 3D print and then began to morph it into a Rubik's Cube. And then for the final exhibition created literally a moving kinetic piece that didn't ever quite turn into a full square, but it sort of symbolised this sort of evolving Rubik's Cube and the complexity of his heart condition. I don't know if it's... Oh, we've got no sound. And each of the artwork tells a different story.
Throughout the exhibition, through sound, through visuals, we really see this idea of honouring the stories that are at the base of the heart of the matter.
There's the medical room.
the room that explores technology, and then the final room which explores the narrative.
It's a beautiful reflection on the heart and on the human story that is behind all of this work.
So, for me, whose body is it? It's the person whose heart we're engaging with, and it's about trying to find ways of connecting and allowing them to engage with their medical condition and their hearts, so that we can sort of tell that story and then share that with the wider public through a sort of an exhibition like The Heart of the Matter.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So our second speaker is Professor Nicola Strickland. Professor Strickland is the immediate past president of the Royal College of Radiologists. She trained in natural sciences and medicine at Oxford and then in radiology at Hammersmith Hospital, and is now a consultant radiologist at Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust in London. Her radiological special interests are in chest and oncological body imaging and in imaging informatics, and she was the clinical lead for imaging informatics at Imperial for 23 years. She's held a really large number of other national and various international leadership roles in radiology, including being president of the radiological section of the Royal Society of Medicine and the founder and chair of the Imaging Informatics Special Interest Group of the UK. And so now I'll hand over to Professor Strickland. Thank you.
Will I also see my presentation on here?
I think you won't see it.
Okay.
You'll just sit on the screen there.
Well, look, thank you very much for that introduction, Katie, and thank you very much for inviting me here this evening. It's a real privilege. Thank you, Natalie, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So, as you will gather, I'm here in my capacity as a my whole life really revolves around imaging various parts of the body. I am a fellow by examination of this college, as well as being a fellow of the Royal College of Radiologists. And
I think probably the other one, green forwards.
you said it was this one? No? No.
When they copied it, they changed it.
Oh, did they? Okay. Okay. So I was asked to give a very brief taste, really, of the sorts of things I spend my life with in terms of images. And so I really am obliged to start off with the very first radiograph, which is this one here, taken by Wilhelm Röntgen back in December 1895 when X-rays were discovered. I always find it rather amusing that he thought fit to X-ray his wife's hand rather than his own hand. But of course, in those days, he didn't really know the damage that X-rays can inflict. But you can see that there is, I mean, this was a miracle really at the time to be able to image body parts and to be able to see the bones and, of course, his wife's wedding ring being dense, being metallic, and some of the flesh, some of the soft tissue. Of course, that compares with the kind of digital image that we can produce today of the hand, where you can see in exquisite detail. Sorry, let's just go back. All the bones and the joints. This is a normal hand and normal wrist, normal joints. But, you know, really, really fantastic detail just in an ordinary plain radiograph. And of course, then that led on to imaging every single part of the body, and much of our workload today in the average hospital is the basic chest X-ray, which actually, interestingly, can contain a huge gamut of disease. So not only can we assess the lungs, obviously, and the heart and mediastinum, the central part of the chest, but also many of the bones and the soft tissues. Again, this is a normal image that I have put up for you, and I'm not really here tonight to talk about pathology particularly, but I just want to sort of just give a few examples of what is my everyday work, really, and to try to give you some kind of a taste of the sorts of things that we can see in these images. And the chest X-ray really is very much the workhorse of our everyday work. I'm sure that many of you have had a cough or a bad cold or some other symptom that has caused you to have a chest x-ray. But many diseases, apart from things like pneumonia or lung cancer or heart disease, can be picked up from a chest x-ray, including metabolic diseases such as something wrong with the hyperparathyroid glands can lead to erosion of the bones. Even exotic things like having parasites in the skin can be seen on a chest x-ray when those parasites die and calcify. So all sorts of weird and wonderful things, as well as very mundane things. And then, of course, it wasn't very long before radiologists started injecting radio-dense contrast media into the blood vessels of the body. And we still do that today. And here's an example of a cerebral angiogram of the carotid artery. So cerebral, the brain, angiogram, demonstration of the, in this case, the arteries, of the carotid artery, which is the main artery, the artery, in fact, that you can feel in your neck, giving the carotid pulse, and supplying the major part of the brain. And this is, again, it's a normal study that I've put up, but you can see the exquisite detail that we have of this main artery coming up here. It is quite tortuous and supplies both the cerebral hemispheres. So any abnormality in that, any small aneurysm or blowout or bleed or abnormality in the vessels is very easily picked up by that kind of investigation. Obviously, we can perform angiograms of every single blood vessel in the body, both the arteries and the veins, a venogram. That's just an example of the brain. And as things have progressed with digital imaging now and with the fantastic advances in technology and in software and in reconstruction, we can take the images that we acquire from CT scanning, from computed tomography, which you'll remember is, if you like, it's a bit like a sausage machine. It's when you lie on a table in a donut-shaped array of X-ray little X-ray tubes with detectors on the other side, and effectively slices of your body are performed as cross-sectional X-rays, and they can then be reconstructed in all sorts of ways. And here is a reconstruction from a CT showing the main blood vessel of your body here, the aorta, dividing into the common iliac and iliac arteries that will supply the pelvis and the legs. And then here we see the heart reconstructed. Here's the main aortic arch, the main blood vessel coming out of the heart, the vessels that will go up to supply the neck, and then the various organs hanging off or supplied by the aorta, the kidneys and the spleen and so on. So we can take the images that we have produced and reconstruct them in all sorts of ways to give us more information about the organs under the skin inside our bodies. Here is, for example, another reconstruction from a CT scan where the front of the chest has been cut away. You can see it bears some resemblance to that chest X-ray I showed you in the beginning. So here are the ribs that have been cut away to reveal a bit of the spine, but also in particular the pulmonary arteries, the main blood vessels going to the lungs that come off the heart here in the middle. So again, exquisite detail, and we can use these sorts of images to show any big blood clots that might get lodged in those pulmonary arteries. You may well have heard of pulmonary embolism, where you get often clots that form in the veins of the legs, actually, after a long plane journey, for example, and then they can, unfortunately, whiz up into the heart and then get jammed in the blood vessels to the lungs. So all those sorts of things, it's we as radiologists, as imaging doctors, who pick that up first, and then that will lead to the appropriate treatment of lysing, of dissolving those clots to allow the blood to flow properly to the lungs again. Obviously, ultrasound was another huge breakthrough earlier last century, which I'm sure many of you will also have had. It's another sort of workhorse modality for us. It's quite cheap. There's no ionizing radiation involved. It's all done sound waves effectively, and we can ultrasound just about every part of the body. And of course, any woman who's had a baby will have had ultrasounds of the baby to see how it's doing, to see if it's the right size, is it growing properly. And here you can see a little fetus even sucking its thumb in the womb. It's quite cute, really. And of course, they move around, and you can image the movement, and you can look at the main organs and make sure that they're all doing okay, and of course intervene if there's anything that isn't right. And nowadays, we quite often do MRI, magnetic resonant imaging, of the fetus inside the womb, inside the uterus. And here is a cine taken in the coronal plane, by which I mean that you're looking at me in this plane straight on. It is a little bit fast, but here you can see many things. You can see the uterus inside the mother's body with the baby inside. You can even beautifully see the orbits, the eyes there. You can see the umbilical cord coming out. And that's of course very important. You see it at the back here. Let me just show it there at the back. So that large area of vascular tissue which forms the placenta, with the umbilical cord coming off it and going into the baby's abdomen. And of course, it's a very, very good means of detecting any abnormalities before the baby is born, which, if severe, might lead to an abortion, an elective abortion, termination of pregnancy, but if not severe, can then kind of guide or alert the obstetrician to what will need to be done when the baby's born. This particular baby did have some abnormalities. I don't know if you can see a little bulge just there, where in fact the gut, which should be inside the baby, is hanging outside the baby's tummy, and that will need to be rectified when the baby's born. And in fact there are some abnormalities in the brain as well, but I'm just sort of showing you these images to give you an idea of the exquisite detail that we now have from our imaging modalities. Obviously MRI, not an ionizing radiation, so no harm to the fetus or indeed to the mother, but very, very beautiful detail can be gained. Here is another imaging modality, which is relatively recent, a PET CT, so that stands for positron emission tomography, which actually sort of has come into being really in my lifetime in medicine, and all the positron emission tomography studies rely on injecting into the body a metabolite which is attached to a radioactive tracer. And in this particular case, it's an 18-fluorine labeled glucose molecule, deoxyfluorine actually as it happens, glucose. Now, any cell that is metabolizing rapidly, in other words turning over rapidly, needs glucose to live and to replicate. And certainly sort of cells of the gut, for example, turn over very rapidly, but what we usually are looking for when we're doing a PET CT scan is cancer cells, abnormal cells. So cancer cells have escaped the normal body regulation. They turn over very rapidly, they metabolize glucose very rapidly, and so you can see that in this particular patient there is an accumulation here, all this very bright glowing material of that labeled glucose molecule around the heart, and that is actually lymphadenopathy. So abnormal lymph glands in a patient who had lymphoma, a type of cancer of the lymph glands. Here is another example of the heart. Actually, it's interesting that our last presentation was largely on the heart, and now we can get beautiful imaging non-invasively of the heart. This was a reconstructed CT scan, which actually, it stopped moving. I don't quite know why. It's meant to be on a loop. Oh, there we go. Okay. So that is what we call a surface rendered, in other words, a 3D reconstruction of the heart seen from the outside. And that's really very helpful to cardiologists or cardiac surgeons in that they can see in exquisite detail, and obviously we can turn it around. Even the coronary arteries, here's one of them tracing along the surface of the heart and the chambers of the heart. And again, we can see the vessels coming out of the heart, for example, in this case, the pulmonary arteries. I've got a few more images of the heart. Can I? Yeah, okay, so here are a couple more images of the heart. Here's a normal cardiac MR, so magnetic resonance of a normal heart, and you can see the beating of the chambers of the heart here. Here are the two atria, that's your left ventricle and right ventricle. Just keep that in your mind as to what a normal heart looks like so that you can compare it with the next example of a diseased heart, which is a dilated cardiomyopathy of the heart. A patient with heart failure, you can see that there's fluid on the lungs here. If you click that for me again, or if I click it again, you can see it moving. And you'll see how those chambers there in the heart, they're hardly moving. And more than that, you can actually see that the blood is refluxing in the wrong direction into these atria. So the whole heart is kind of like a flabby bag, if you like. It's not beating, it's not contracting properly. And that could be for several reasons. It could be the patient had had extensive heart attack in the past. It could be the patient had had a very severe viral infection of the heart, a viral cardiomyopathy. But there are other types of cardiomyopathy as well, and here is another one where we see a different problem is affecting the heart, that the heart muscle, again, it's not really running properly. I'm not sure why. Let me just go back. It'd just be nice for you to see that beating, but it's not going to beat. But what you can see is that there's very thickened, there we go, heart muscle here in both the left ventricle and the right ventricle, because in fact the muscle of the heart has been infiltrated by an abnormal glycoprotein, which has caused that thickness of the heart to be miles bigger than it should be, which of course leads to inefficiency of the heart action. So, in conclusion, all I've been able to do is to show you a tiny, minuscule little taste of a huge gamut of imaging's ability to reveal what is under the skin. But hopefully you've got just some kind of inkling of really what a very rapidly and constantly evolving field I and other radiologists work in. And that's partly due to the tremendous speed of technical innovation in the machines that actually can acquire these images, but also, of course, to the tremendous strides that we see every day, really, in software evolution. And I think hopefully it gives you an idea of why, for me, certainly, radiology and imaging is one of the most exciting and fast-moving fields in the whole of medicine and surgery. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Liz Orton. Liz is a visual artist who works with photography, text and image to explore the relationship between images, power and authorship. And her work engages widely with archives, both real and imagined, to explore tensions between personal and scientific forms of knowledge. She's an associate lecturer on the BA in photography at the London College of Communication and teaches elsewhere and has other associateships in various places. She worked on, she was a recipient, of a Wellcome Trust Arts Award for Digital Insides, a project about medical imaging technologies, and has edited a book called Becoming Image, Medicine and the Algorithmic Gaze. Liz's piece, Everybody as an Archive, is one of the two video works we have as part of Under the Skin, and I know some of you were able to watch it on the big screen here earlier. If you haven't had a chance to see it yet, it is also playing on the TV outside in the exhibition. But before we get to any of that, let's hear from Liz. Thank you.
Thank you. I can't think of anything more terrifying than talking about radiology after a radiologist. So I don't know very much about radiology. I haven't got any visuals, sorry, because I showed the film, so I'm just going to talk a bit. So yeah, as Katie said, thank you. The film is part of a much bigger project that I did called Digital Insides, which I mostly did in collaboration with someone called Steve Halligan at UCLH. When I started the project 5 years ago, I didn't really know anything about medical imaging, but I just knew that it was interesting as a sort of changing space for representation. Some of the things I learned early on that became little starting points for me as a result of doing a lot of interviews with radiographers and radiologists was I was surprised to understand how often medical images are sort of inconclusive or uncertain and therefore need to be verified, and that's by other medical images. So it's this interesting kind of cycle of the more images you have, the more you need. Also, I guess increasingly now to be a patient is actually to become an image. Imaging is so much part of everything clinically now. But often the subject, i.e. us, the patient, we often never see, or it's unusual still, to see our images. And also medical images in a way can enable the absence of the patient, the absence of the body, because clinical decisions can be made through the image. So being an artist making work in a hospital is really challenging for all the obvious reasons, to do with people being vulnerable and overstretched. And that's obviously staff as well as patients. But I really knew that I didn't want to just make work kind of as an outsider. I wanted to work out how I could do something kind of from the inside, and that ended up being like from the inside institutionally in the hospital, also from the inside of the body itself. And I trained myself to use radiology software, radiology viewing software, and kind of 3D reconstruction algorithms, which is what became kind of part of the film you see. And I wanted to do that not because I just wanted to see the body, but I wanted to make visible the kind of technological gaze, the sort of systems of vision within hospitals and radiology. Anyway, around all that time I was doing that and doing research, my mum, she had almost every, oh, something's changed. Yeah. Am I too close? Okay, I'll stand back. So my mum became ill. The film is partly about my mum. She had almost every kind of imaging scan possible. And it was over a year after she died that I started looking at her medical images. And by then I was actually really quite skilled at using this software. And I'd looked at a lot of patients. And that's what the film became, which was an attempt to take up this very personal encounter I was having, in a sense with my mum's archive, but mediated through this kind of very clinical software. And I had my mum's consent to show these images, but I realised quickly that I didn't want to, that I wasn't comfortable with that, and I thought in any way it was probably more interesting to represent my experience of looking for her, of seeing her, and the kind of voyeurism, I guess, that's almost possible through these sort of technologies now. So I don't know how many of you saw the film, but I guess the film seems to be about my mum, and it is, but what you learn at the end is, you know, it's actually other patients that you're seeing. And these are patients who gave their explicit consent for me to use their reconstructed data in this work. They're anonymised data. What you can't see in the film is the 2-year consent process that we went through to use that data and to ask to find a way to ask for consent. The reason for using kind of data from other people that wasn't just my mum's was also because I was really interested in all these bigger questions arising from kind of machine vision, if you like, the increasing role of computers, and all the questions that are raised through that, like more broadly around privacy and ownership, spectatorship, access to, use of, distribution of medical images. It took me quite a while to work out that actually if you want to learn more about what's going on in kind of medical imaging, that it's you get so far in talking to a doctor, but actually you need to go and talk to computer scientists, because computer science is kind of leading a lot of the field at the moment. And medical images are kind of now one of the most important sources of biomedical data. And I'm interested in this emerging economy in machine diagnosis. So using artificial intelligence increasingly to detect and diagnose disease through automated forms of image analysis, kind of pattern recognition software essentially. And there's a long way to go, and it's extremely complicated for many, many reasons.
especially the enormous variations, not only in kind of pathologies, but bodies too. I guess I wanted to say that I really don't have anything, I don't think, in principle against the use of kind of artificial intelligence in medicine. But we definitely need to address kind of important questions around data bias. And also we need to talk about how humans and machines might kind of work together in the delivery of improved care. I mean, it's very much pitched like human versus AI at the moment, but of course there's a place for both. And it's urgent because there is a billions of dollars worth of new AI software for this medical image analysis in the pipeline. I was reading a trade journal recently, and a prominent radiologist wrote that the hustle to get access to medical image data and make it exclusive and proprietary reminds me of the gold rush 2 centuries ago. I guess, so yeah, I don't want to get too heavy on this. I'll skip a bit of the talk, but one of the issues is that the ethical and privacy frameworks are kind of lagging behind advances in the use of artificial intelligence, and we're all part of this. So the question of whose body? Well, everybody's body, right? There's increasing numbers of data sharing agreements between healthcare trusts and software companies for research, for machine learning. So it's interesting, in the UK, the General Medical Council's guidelines allow ethics committees to agree to research that retrospectively uses anonymised data without explicit patient consent. So I'm not saying that that's unethical or that something unethical is taking place, because obviously health providers go to extreme lengths. We have very robust regulatory frameworks to protect patient privacy and confidentiality. I'm just interested. I don't think the kind of separation of the image from the patient is a kind of secure thing. And, we're seeing a kind of new image economy, if you like, and the commodification of patient data on a kind of unprecedented scale. So my speculative kind of feeling about this is that actually the internal body itself is becoming vulnerable to new forms of kind of calculation and speculation, not just clinical, financial is what I'm saying. And so the relationship between the inside and the outside of the body, which was previously mediated through the clinic, is like increasingly vulnerable to being mediated through the free market. That's my contentious position on all this, which of course is quite speculative, but thank you.
That's okay. I mean,
the film, yeah.
I think you do. I think that does speak actually very strongly to the issues in the film.
Okay,
just you don't talk about it explicitly.
Directly.
I think there's a lot of links there. Okay, so our next speaker in this smorgasbord of different opinions is Ian Berle. Ian Berle was head of medical illustration for a great many years at the Royal London Hospital and St Bart's. He's the specialist assessor for the legal, ethical and copyright module of Staffordshire University's Medical Illustration Certificate and Diploma course. He has postgraduate degrees in bioethics as well as in privacy law. So, we have thought about the links here. And has written a thesis on face recognition technology and its effect on privacy and confidentiality. Ian's recent work concerns how the right to one's own image might be adequately protected, and he has a forthcoming book, plug alert, based on his thesis, which will discuss the issues from his thesis. So, over to Ian.
Thank you. It's very unusual for a photographer not to show images, but I don't work in a department any longer, and I wouldn't have been able to get permission to show any images. So it's going to be text-based, and I hope this will try to bring some of the strands, and I must keep an eye on the time as well, some of the strands together. And what we've heard so far is some very good examples of what Michel Foucault called the clinical gaze. Everyone is curious. Rodigan wanted to see what his machine would do in 1895. Now, where would we be without him? we wouldn't be having a meeting like this. So everyone is interested in the clinical gaze. I would say that you wouldn't be here if you weren't. Okay, now, let's have a look at what the differences are between clinical photography, and I've summarised them. And these are really only headlines. Each one of these represents a lecture programme in itself. Okay, and I'm not busking for any of that. So clinical photography, and what I've done is you'll see 2 columns, and I'll go through these headlines as quickly and as clearly as possible. Clinical photography is representational. When a photographer wants to become a clinical photographer, they have to demonstrate their skills in what's known as standardized representational photography. It is patient-centered. It's only about the patient. It's representational because it represents the condition that that patient presents with. It's standardized because it has to be repeated. So in a treatment program, you would have to have the same position in the lighting, the same magnification ratio, even the same background, same setup, absolutely spot on, so that a department that has 2 or 3 photographers wouldn't necessarily have the same photographer photographing the patient. So each photographer follows each other's work and duplicates or replicates the treatment program progress as it goes. That's why SRP, as it's known, is essential. It's also consented. We heard how long it took Liz to get consent. Well, consent in a hospital department is done at the time of the consultation with the doctor, who then refers the patient to the photographer. The photographer then checks the consent and that the patient has understood what the photography involves, hence the term informed consent. Now, looking at medical art, it's only representative. You wouldn't have an artist drawing every patient. And an anatomical drawing is an anatomical drawing. It's anonymous, it represents a human body. However, medical art falls into an area of whose interests, who asks for the drawing to be done, whose interests are being served. The photography is patient-centered. It's only about the patient. Secondary uses might be teaching, it might be publication, but at the end, the primary or principal purpose of the photography is just for the patient record. So it's consented and it's confidential. It has to be repeatable. Now, moving down that list, a medical artist will be illustrating something, maybe simplifying something that a photograph cannot do. If I were to photograph, and I've done many a time, photographed an open abdomen in an operating theatre, there's a lot of stuff inside once you make an incision. You get a lot of blood. And okay, it can look pretty gory. But an artist can separate out the anatomy and demonstrate what the doctor, what the surgeon wants to see. All that the photographer is doing in the theatre is getting a record of what is found at that surgery. So it becomes documentary. Medical art is arguably complementary. It complements what the photographer can see and what the surgeon or doctor wants to illustrate. The photograph is indexical, meaning it's only related to that person. Medical art is emblematic. It's a symbol of what is seen. We look round. A good example of that is that ceramic of what could only be called a chest cavity, but it doesn't represent your lungs. That is not that's not an artist's impression of a radiological image that we saw that Professor Strickland showed. And I would call that a derivative. Not in any sense a derogatory way, but it's a way of interpreting in an artistic form what your chest cavity might look like. So it's emblematic. Now, what's interesting is that both photography and art is copyrighted. However, photographers who work in a hospital are not the copyright owner. The NHS Trust is the copyright owner. The artist, on the other hand, is the copyright owner and would license that copyright, if I've understood this right, to the person who's commissioned the work. The copyright is still held by the artist. One is also a medical record, another is abstract. The body print out there is not a medical record. It's an abstract of a body. So, how does this all go together? Now, we talked about consent. Now, there is this thing called GDPR. Some of us might have been involved in trying to get our organisations to be compliant. Well, in 2018, it was taken into British law, UK law, and it's called the Data Protection Act 2018. And it has all sorts of caveats, clauses about consent, what you can do with the material, and so on. And it even has in Article 9 something about biometrics and AI, and what you can or cannot do. Medical art, on the other hand, is subject to the Copyright Design and Patents Act, 1988. It may not have anything to do with data. A lot of the material on display would come under the Copyright Act, not the Data Protection Act, because it's anonymous, it's unknown, it's emblematic, and not indexical. So, just in summarising some of this, whose body? Well, we heard it's everybody's body. It's your and mine, yours and my body. But in clinical photography, it's a known body. It's a living body, generally. If a clinical photographer photographs someone who isn't living, that's forensic photography. It is also personal because it relates to the patient, you and me. It is also supportive because it can help treatment progress and follow that process through. It helps well-being if the photography is done for various specialties. Medical art is often done with subjects who are unknown. Often, in terms of anatomical drawings and art, it's cadaveric, not forensic, cadaveric. It's derived and it's impersonal. But one of the most fascinating and interesting things that I came across in my career was when Mark Gilbert started to work for Ian Hutchinson, doing the painting that series of pictures of Ian Hutchinson's patients, which were then turned into portraits called Saving Faces. And they had an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery about 15 years ago. It's still online. It's worth a look. So medical art can be affirming because people who were sitting for Mark were people who might have been ignored. And yet Mark's art dignifies those people, those patients. So, in closing, I would suggest, if you want to dig a little deeper, Cecil's Faber's Whose Body Is It Anyway? Justice and Integrity of the Person is a very interesting read. Michel Foucault, Birth of the Clinic, I would say, if you want to get an understanding of the birth of the clinic and what the clinical gaze is, and the history of that, this is essential reading. And then Rohan Hardcastle, who's a solicitor, wrote his book, Law and the Human Body, Property Rights, Ownership and Control. You don't own your organs. And the law's changing about donation and so on. But I don't want to make any comment about that with my bioethics background as well. Okay, and finally, there are some professional resources out there, but there's one that isn't on there that I'll mention. First of all, GMC guidelines would make interesting reading, making and using visual and audio recordings of patients And the Institute of Medical Illustrators is a great resource if you want to see how the profession handles all of this kind of material. And if you're interested in AI, a little while ago, the Nuffield Trust set up the Ava Lovelace Institute, and it's looking at AI in all its manifestations. So have a look at their website, the Ava Lovelace Institute. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ian. So our last panellist tonight is Amanda Couch. Amanda is an artist, researcher and senior lecturer at the University for the Creative Arts in Farnham. Her work cuts across media, and her practice and research includes performance, live and recorded image, print and book, sculpture, food, participation, writing, all sorts of things. She has what she calls an ongoing obsession with the digestive system, metaphorically and materially, and how it's employed to explores processing, and embodied ways of knowing and becoming. Amanda's work, or two prints from Amanda's series called Liver Models, are included in the exhibition, and I understand that Amanda's going to bring perhaps the non-human into our discussions today, in part. So over to Amanda.
Thank you. Hello. So yeah, my work in the show differs, which I understand is that from most of the other work in the exhibition, that it depicts the organs of non-human subjects and those that very much did not give their consent. Part of the series of 12 liver models from 2016, they are a pair of direct prints from the surface of actual livers from two different lambs. The liver models are part of the Exdispicy in the Everyday project, and the series A Woman Holding a Liver, where I performed a contemporary manifestation of the ancient ritual of liver divination. The works draw on the ancient Mesopotamian practice of exdispicy, or divination using the entrails. As Robert Temple writes in Odyssey, the Glaxo Wellcome Journal of Innovation in Healthcare, the ancients were fascinated by the tales that entrails tell, and in which autopsies of animals were used to analyse the health of the environment and predict the future. The liver models were printed by traditional jiataku, the Japanese method of printing fish, a form of nature printing. Developed in the Middle Ages, nature printing could be argued as an early and simple form of scientific imaging, which was used to accurately depict medicinal plants. By the Renaissance, it had become a well-known and well-renowned scientific process of reproducing plants. However, its roots lay in plant printing, but has also been used to reproduce three-dimensional materials such as stones and fish. The liver is a receptive material, like a copper plate, treated with a soft ground. Chance forms it. The liver is inscribed by its anatomical neighbours in the belly cavity, which determine the markings that can be seen on the surface. In ancient Mesopotamia, these were known as drawrings, grooves that diviners would have observed, an index of the lamb's life lived. For example, the presence and path are grooves on the Babylonian right lobe formed by the impression of the abomasum, or the fourth stomach, and the throne base is the impression made by the right kidney. These and other markings pointed to the creature's wider environment. Unexpected things come to light from entrails, Temple proposes. Creatures which appear healthy can be seen to be diseased by examining their intestines and livers. The diseases revealed by exdispicy, together with their inauspicious signs, often came from the unwholesomeness of the environment. Nomads, he continues, from very early times used such indicators as cues to move on to healthier pastures. This was animal autopsy used to gauge the environment and make decisions about where to live. My prints appear to be made in an instant. when the inky surface meets blank paper, a moment in comparison to the long, meticulously observed draftings of many of the historical and contemporary illustrations in the exhibition. And yes, it is a fairly swift process. Ink is applied to the liver's surface, dabbed off, paper is laid, and a gentle rubbing applied. Not a burnishing nor a pressing, but a caress, and then lifted to reveal the imprint. But the development of the plate, of the liver itself, is much longer, etched over many years from birth until death, and is out of my control. The engraving of the liver plate reflects the life of the animal, how it was treated, how it lived, it was cared for, what it ate, its relationships with other animals, humans, insects, parasites, how it was transported for slaughter, how it was killed and butchered, and of course none of this, including being part of my project, the animal had any consent over. Animals have been routinely used to understand the workings of bodies, both human and their own, throughout the history of medicine. The earliest examinations of sacrificial victims in the practice of extispicy, and then later physicians in ancient Greece explored the anatomy of animals for their research. Alcmaeon of Croton in the 5th century BCE employed the dissection of animals, and Galen in the 2nd century performed vivisection, forming the basis of many of his writings, which persisted as canonical, authoritative, and undisputed until the Renaissance. For the ancient Greeks at least, using animals live or otherwise to further human understanding was not a moral concern, adhering to rigorous hierarchy where all living and non-living natural things, from minerals to the gods, were ranked according to their proximity to the divine. Ideas which would endure and underscore the Judeo-Christian worldview of the superiority of humans over nature, which arguably our global environmental crisis is a result of. According to Nuno Henrique Franco, the use of animal experiments to satisfy scientific inquiry would only re-emerge in the Renaissance, with Flemish anatomist Vesalius, who created the foundations of modern comparative anatomy. Arguments during the so-called Age of Enlightenment, despite both failing to deny animal sentience, saw Descartes invoking machinism, a view of animals as soulless, senseless automata, to justify his own vivisections, and philosopher Spinoza writing that we should use animals as we please, treating them in the best way that suits us, for their nature is not like ours. Franco argues that despite this era's initiating the departure from the Christian theocentrism, in this new anthropocentric view, animals continue to have no moral standing on their own. She draws parallels to other oppressive attitudes and behaviours of the period when the slave market thrived and women were seen as inferior. My provocation points to the emerging scene of multi-species studies, which challenges the idea of human supremacism and aims to go beyond viewing other creatures as mere symbols, resources, or backgrounds for the lives of humans. Tom van Doren Benkertzi and Ursula Munster write, life cannot arise and be sustained in isolation. Organisms are situated within deep, entangled histories, and so, beyond mere survival, particular lifeways in all their resplendent diversity emerge from interwoven patterns of living and dying, of being and becoming in a larger world. They propose a practice of passionate immersion, which means becoming curious and so entangled, learning to be affected, and so perhaps to understand and care a little differently. And I'd like to conclude by evoking two final kind of points in relation to this. The Great Ape Personhood movement, which aims to extend legal personhood to apes, a distinction that recognises these non-human animals as beings with the capacity to hold both rights and duties. The movement achieved success in 2008 in Spain when the Parliament passed a resolution granting human rights to apes. And in New York in 2015, 2 chimpanzees, Hercules and Leo, received recognition as legal persons and were granted the right not to be imprisoned against their will. Finally, such successes for the rights of apes highlights what Thelma Rowell, a former primatologist and now sheep observer, calls the failures of ethology, the study of human behaviour, which she states is a hierarchical scandal, in that we have given primates multiple chances, but we know just about nothing about the others, particularly sheep. Rowell states, sheep have an additional difficulty compared to most other animals, particularly farm animals, because they cannot effectively protest. A cow you have to treat with a little more respect because they are bigger than you. With sheep, you can do what you like. They don't make any obvious protest. They just get miserable. In her essay, Do Sheep Have Opinions?, Viancien Desprit presents Thelma Rowell's experience with her sheep writing. As the etymology of the word reminds us, to protest means above all to testify, and that is precisely where sheep's problems lie. They have never been able to testify to what interests them, since whatever it is that might interest them has been offered no affordance, no possibility of articulation with what interests those who attest on their behalf. And that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Right, am I on? Yes, grand. So thank you very much to all of our speakers. I think some of you might be getting handheld mics, because I think some of the radio mics might have given up the ghost. Is that fit? Okay, great, lovely. So there is such a lot of food for thought in this, and I've been scribbling away notes in an effort to try and come up with some kind of key themes that have been discussed and maybe some prompting questions to start the discussion as we open it out. First of all, I'm bobbling in and out as well, aren't I? How's that? I think we've really dived into some of the multifaceted understandings that we have of the body. Everyone's answered the question of whose body is it in a really different way. We've gone from the very personal experiences that Sophie's talked about through the very clinical aspects and the amazing things that are being done now in clinic, that Nicola, that you've talked about, that you know, the ways we can help the unborn child. But from a very, is this one on instead? Is that better? Yeah, a very clinical perspective, to the mechanical and the gold digging perspective on it maybe, through the record keeping, the documentary, the very sort of clinical records aspect of medical photography, to realms beyond the human body that I haven't really considered in the curating the exhibition at all, but open it up in a very wide way. But I guess my first question to the panel, and anyone can leap in on this, is this thinking about this changing ethics across time from the very ancient world to the present day. And it made me think this idea of gold digging that you talked about, Liz, the prospectors, the way that intelligence is now a sort of new field opening up for people to kind of grab this data and make money from it. To what extent do people think that maybe that's partly what was behind Vesalius? Vesalius produces this amazing book of anatomy with these fabulously detailed pictures which show people the body in a way it's never been seen before. It's fabulously important for clinical medicine eventually, but the world of surgery at his time, no one's doing surgery that's detailed enough that those images are going to make much difference. To what extent is that selling the body? Can you hear me at all now? Yeah. You can. Am I there? I'm there. To what extent do you think that Vesalius's book is that kind of thing as well? It's kind of making money off the back of exploiting or making the most of pictures of the human body. That's for anyone who has a thought. And if none of you answer, I'll pick one.
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, your question really is, are we asking what Vesalius himself intended from it? I must say, I'd always assumed that, that it was the pursuit of knowledge, and not making money out of an exploitation, if you like, of the human body. I mean, I think it is interesting to draw parallels with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is hugely topical in radiology and in imaging. I welcome artificial intelligence, I have to say, with open arms. There are not enough radiologists in the UK. We are hugely understaffed, not because it isn't a massively popular discipline to go into for junior doctors, and we're turning away 4 or 5 junior doctors for every post we have, but because the government won't fund any more training. So we can do with all the help we can get, actually, from machinery, and so I like to think of it as augmented intelligence. And we need the researchers and the vendors and so forth to have access to as much data as possible. Obviously, it's important that those data be anonymized properly so that patients aren't identified, but it is going to help all of us if those algorithms that are being developed are based on as much clinical data as we can get hold of. But you are right, it is interesting that there is this huge hunger for data amongst the scientists and the computer engineers, and particularly the vendors. And so that is leading to, in some instances, in the UK, as well as what we've seen in the USA, financial bids effectively being made to large hospital consortia to pay for access to those data. What is actually tending to happen is that they are being accessed behind hospital firewalls, so that the data don't have to be anonymised in that they're not being taken out from the hospital firewall, or some kind of a deal is made such that the vendors or developers will say, well, if we have any spin-off, if we make software, an algorithm in AI that is useful, we will let your hospital have it, or we will let the NHS have it, or whatever, at cost price, or whatever that may be. But it's also extremely interesting that in other parts of the world, in low and middle income countries, India, China, and so forth, there is actually nothing stopping developers or vendors going out and purchasing data, and that is what is happening actually. Yes. Huge amounts of of chest X-rays, for example. So yes, I think it is an area we need to be careful about.
Yes, and because the desire to have the cash from selling those images is so high, and then but presumably those countries then don't benefit from that and probably aren't able to buy the products or the tools or the systems that result on the back of it.
You can't develop a sound algorithm in AI without having large amounts of data, and those data you have to have non-overlapping subsets of data to train the algorithm in the first place, to validate it and to test it, or else you retrofit the data and make a false algorithm. And I mean, who's to say that, for example, I don't know, some software that was developed to artificially to read or automatically to read, say, mammograms on patient women in, say, Tel Aviv, Israel, where some of these companies are based, for example, are going to work on women's breasts in Taunton, Somerset. It's by no means evident.
Yes.
I was actually judging a panel for Innovate UK today, where these are large grants from the government awarded for innovation in medicine and for development of AI, as it happens. And we had a discussion about an algorithm that's being developed to recognise skin lesions. So not particularly my field, but by taking photographs of lesions and having those automatically analysed. And this particular work was being done in Scotland. Now, in Scotland, they will get certain types of skin diseases. They are less likely to get things like melanoma of the skin. There are fewer immigrants from overseas, from Afro-Caribbean origin or Indian origin or whatever. So there will be certain diseases that that population is not going to display particularly. And so if they take that algorithm and then, say, take it down to East London, it's not necessarily going to perform so well. It will need to be retrained.
And this has been a problem in medical data for a very long time, isn't it? With any data set, that what you put in will influence what you get out, and we assume a universality in what we put in based on the societal prejudices and biases of the time, which overlook certain sectors of society or disproportionately represent them without due acknowledgement of that.
We are talking about the greater good. We are talking about giving up our data, if you like, in an anonymised fashion to develop something that will serve the population at large.
Liz, did you want to?
Feels like it's been pretty comprehensively addressed.
Oh, okay.
But no, I mean, I guess the gold prospecting is interesting, and you can continue the metaphor because people talk about data mining and new forms of extraction. It's this, and that I guess to go back to your question, I can't remember who wrote that the history of medicine might be understood as a continuing attempt to make the body visible. So this, and those things have always been subject to kind of economic interest, right?
Yes, yeah.
So I don't think the two things are so separable, which I guess is a point I'd like to make generally, is that I don't see medicine and art as being quite so separate as perhaps they're being kind of set up to be. And a long time ago, they were much more interrelated, and I think that there are interesting questions about artists producing knowledge about the body as well as doctors producing knowledge about the body. So what's interesting in terms of, some of the work that we've heard about tonight is how we might produce kind of new configurations, new understandings through the kinds of collaborations and conversations that are arising across disciplines now. So I would slightly challenge, I'm afraid, your model of the kind of the doctor does this and the artist does that. I think actually what's interesting is the overlap and the kind of generative possibilities in the middle. I'll say one more thing and then I'll finish, which I guess the thing that's happening now that's different is that the kind of data mining it's global, and actually my data, your data, because we live now in kind of platform capitalism. It can be shared, distributed in unlimited ways across the world in an instant, and that's different from Vesalius. Is that the right pronunciation?
I've heard Vesalius.
One's a volcano, yes. I think.
It's
anyway,
a
that's my
form.
yeah. Okay, thanks.
Who knows? I think we might open this up to the audience, because I bet if there are questions. If not, we can keep talking. But if anyone has a question, stick your hand up. Yes, there's one here. If you could wait for the microphone, and that way, hopefully, everyone can hear you.
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed that. I was really hoping we could go back to Ian's slides on the distinctions between clinical photography or medical photography and medical art, because it struck me that... that's not working, is it? Hello?
Yep.
Right, so the kind of medical art you're talking about doesn't really chime with the artistic practices of the three artists on the panel. So I was hoping we could get the slides up and the three artists could have the kind of right to address that.
Beginning to say. So maybe
I think that there's a thing here about terminology perhaps as well, that there's medical art and there's art that addresses medical issues, and they're quite different. There can be an overlap and they can be quite different, but maybe can we get the slides from the fourth speaker back up? We'll see if we can do that. And do any of our artists have Sophie, do you have a comment on that, the sort of where they do and don't meet?
Well, I think one's illustrative and one is more a reflection and a conversation.
So, within my own, and I think continuing also on from Liz's point about sort of authorship, I think it's really interesting how scientists and clinicians now are beginning to sort of really embrace having an artist as part of a research team, and I think there's something really interesting about the artist as the researcher, and that seeing an artist practice as having the same validity as a medical sort of practice. But there is still a sort of, I think, an imbalance of power, and there's a sort of, I think there's an urgency for artists' sort of voice to be given the sort of same equivalence that the scientific voice does. Through my practice, I don't cure somebody's life, but maybe through my practice I can help bring a sort of quality of life to somebody and a reflection and a validation of their life that is different from society's understanding of what a normal life should be. So I think yes,
I don't think, I'm not a medical artist, I'm an artist who reflects on the medical landscape, and I think there's quite a different sort of positioning around that.
Can I respond?
Yes, please do.
The purpose of separating it was not to sort of have it in kind of black and white in the way I might have presented it. For me, and as a photographer, and also having spent quite a long time looking at sort of the ethical nature of photography and indeed art, and the issues of privacy law and so on, and the right to one's own image, which we don't have in the UK, we've got to be careful whose interests. The issue is that if a patient or a person who is a patient, and that could be you or me, is not fully aware of what the program is or the process is or the connection, they can be seen just as an object and not a subject. And if we're not careful, we objectify medical conditions, human beings, for the sake of whatever it is. And there was a time in medicine where we were just objects. There was a time when consent was not part of the photographic landscape. When cameras started being put on phones, various doctors used to just take pictures of their patients without consent. And there are numerous accounts of that. Hospitals started to then introduce policies, and the current approach, and indeed the GMC guidelines, has its genesis from the 1980s, when policies in hospitals started to be generated. The GMC is very clear that whatever the record is for, whether it's a photograph, an audio recording, a video, some videoing, or an art form, consent has to be provided.
If the image is recognisable.
Well, you start with the patient, and that patient, until that point, is recognisable. If part of their anatomy is not recognisable, then then you can go forward and anonymise. But one of the things that photography departments used to do before digital imaging was we photographed a lot of X-rays. But before an X-ray could be published in a journal, we had to strip out from that image any identifying feature, including the name of the hospital. So
but that's still the case.
And that's still the case. But it can be done digitally now and not longhand with negatives and setups that photograph X-rays.
Can I just chip in there with a question then? Because I think many of us would think looking at an X-ray that isn't identifiable.
That's true.
And so what's the line? So there.
But it's
okay. We'll have three comments. Sophie first.
One of the things I thought was very interesting is that when you displace a heart, which is somebody's heart that has they have a congenital heart disorder, and it's maybe not recognisable by the general public, but the surgeons and the medics will understand whose heart that is. And so it's a very niche audience, but people can interpret those models. So, I mean, that's one of the things that we've come into sort of during the project we sort of came into.
And that's an issue, just a quick, but that's an issue that comes up with data sets as well, isn't it, when you get to very specific conditions or combinations of factors. I said I'd let Nicola, and then and then.
No, I mean I agree with that. I mean the idea is that if I wouldn't recognise my own liver, for example, or my own heart if it were made into a model. If there is a condition that is, of course, most of the congenital heart diseases are. I mean, they're rare, but then there are hundreds of them, thousands of them. So you actually wouldn't be able to see one total anomalous venous drainage and distinguish it from another. So I mean, it's very important, obviously, to protect the privacy of the individual. And I would totally support that, but it would be very, very unusual to have a condition that was so unique, if you like, that there weren't any others in the world, and that would be recognisable. But yes, it's entirely proper to strip out any of the so-called DICOM headers, in other words, the demographics that are either burnt into the image or incorporated in a digital image, and that does include hospital numbers or addresses or dates of birth or whatever, and I think that's right and proper, and we should certainly support that. I would certainly support it. But I mean, if ever you're in any way concerned, then take consent from a patient if you can.
Just a quick point. So I think what's interesting is how the technology itself is making anonymization of images that much harder. So you can strip out all the identifiers, but you've got 683 image slices that you can reconstruct into a 3D form in an instant, and all sorts of things become visible in that reconstruction where you can see the body. I've been looking at all sorts of data sets which are officially anonymized. You can quite easily reconstruct those data sets into a 3D form where you can begin to see things that might be features within the body that could make somebody identifiable.
Yeah.
So it's getting more complicated.
Sophie, do you want? Amanda, do you want to chip in on this? Any of this up a bit?
I've just been printing livers, and I didn't think that would be something that would show difference, but they were all extraordinarily different from the same butcher. I presume then that they were probably from the same farm and probably from the same breed of sheep. I bought 12 in one day, so I presume they kind of came, but they were all extraordinarily different. So you would have, they were individuals. They showed the individual life of that animal. It's just that you wouldn't have necessarily been able to interpret that, or you interpreted it as you would. And as if I put my liver divination hat on, I would be able to tell whether, if I asked it a particular question, whether I'd get a positive or negative result for that. I know we're in a very different world now where that isn't what happens, but it has happened and people are still doing that around the world.
Yeah, I think I'm conscious of time. I think this is probably a good point to stop. Mm-hmm. I think this hits at a lot of the heart of the issues I was hoping to express in the exhibition and the events programme to go with it, so I'm really grateful to everyone for voicing your opinions. If people want to carry on discussing it, if they want to take issue with me for what I've included in the exhibition or left out, or if you want to chat to each other, or probably, I think our speakers, can you hang around for a bit if people want to talk to you afterwards, then please do. But I think we'll end it there with the tensions between the general and the individual, the anonymous and the identifiable. We don't know whose body it is, it's all of our bodies. And I guess we all have a role in making sure that our bodies are used in ways that we're happy with, and that any data we come into contact with is treated in the most appropriate ways we can manage. Just before we finish, some reminders. There is a cash bar downstairs. The exhibition is running for a bit more this evening and then carries on until the 3rd of April, and we have more events coming up throughout the series. We also have a new trail that takes you around the other museum collections here, showing you some other aspects of anatomy that are represented in the collections. I'd like to thank Stage Text for doing absolutely sterling work. I'm going to try this microphone. Can we thank Stage Text? Thank you. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our 5 amazing speakers tonight: Sophie, Nicola, Liz, Ian, and Amanda. Thank you very much.